Metal Gear Solid is a Nippon Bond simulator released in 1998 for the PlayStation. It features the 3D reimagining of Solid Snake as he infiltrates a nuclear disposal facility occupied by a small terrorist group ransoming the United States for the remains of Big Boss and $1 billion under threat of a nuclear attack. This game is 17 years old now. I doubt this review will decide whether you'll play the game, if you haven't already. More so, it's more of a retrospective evaluation, and not even a good one at that. I'm still going to undermine the hell out of it because, fuck it, why not? Anyway, the point is that there are some spoilers ahead, so if you haven't played the game before, I recommend you do so, because it's still worth discovering on your own. Dated as it may be, it's still a good game. Now with those formalities out of the way, it's time to beat some dead horses. Boot that sumbitch up. Grab some popcorn and feel free to chow down without fear of buttering up your controller because you won't be using it all that much anyway. Metal Gear Solid is heavily story-based. There are hours worth of codec conversations and cutscenes to endure. Solid Snake's objective is to confirm whether or not the terrorists are capable of launching a nuke and then stopping them if they do. His secondary objective is to rescue 2 hostages trapped within the facility, specifically the Arms Tech President and the DARPA Chief. And thirdly, he is to repeat the last 2 words everyone says.
Revolution, Rex, Baker, Psycho Mantis, card keys, 2nd floor basement.
I made a whole video with every instance if you're curious. The terrorists are comprised of Foxhound Unit and the Genome Soldiers. Foxhound is comprised of elite military specialists led by Liquid Snake, and the Genome Soldiers are genetically modified soldiers designed to specialize in military duties. But really they just shoot guns and have bad nearsightedness. Liquid Snake's true intentions is to launch Metal Gear Rex, a nuclear-armed walking tank, so he can carve his own destiny, but also fulfill his father's legacy, somehow? The rest of Foxhound just follows Liquid because he tells them to, except for Ocelot, who's a spy. Grey Fox, a rogue cyborg ninja, pops in every now and then as well because he's fucking crazy. Solid Snake has his own Scooby-Doo entourage to help him out via radio shoved into his ears. Colonel Campbell dynamically reaffirms Snake's mission goals repeatedly throughout the game. Naomi is a geneticist on board to act all British and stuff and berate Snake for smoking.
Are you smoking?
Yeah, so what?
Nastasha is a weapons expert, Otacon is an inside informant, Miller is a survival coach, and Mei Ling is just adorable. I could spend this whole video summarizing the story and all the merits it brings, but I'd like to take this video to talk about the gameplay itself. There are plenty of other story videos strewn throughout YouTube. Bear in mind, it's unfair to judge Metal Gear Solid solely on its gameplay qualities. VR Missions is an example of the Metal Gear gameplay given its own game without being bogged down by a story. I would say from a raw gameplay perspective that it's superior, but more people, including myself, would still see Solid as a better game because of its story and atmosphere. So, if we cut out all the story elements, the runtime drops from 11 hours to about 3 or 4, and you can shave off even more if you know exactly what you're doing. Fairly bare bones, but it is a PS1 game, and the time taken up by the story and cutscenes is at least interesting. The contrast of the amount of story to gameplay in the beginning is a bit strange, but as the game progresses it becomes a bit more familiar and forgivable, to a point that you keep on playing just to see the story unfold rather than experience the stealth gameplay, which by that point has become more action-oriented. Whenever the game gets bored of pretending to be a movie, you navigate around this tiny vector map here and make your dot not touch any of these vision cones. We've certainly come a long way from being 16 pixels avoiding the direct line of sight of guards to becoming a single pixel avoiding the gaze of a troop of half-blind toddlers with guns. The rest of the screen is a more aesthetic representation of the vector map, but if you ask me, it's more like a means of assisting that fearless white dot traverse the cruel Matrix world he's trapped inside. That is until you trigger an alert phase and suddenly, oh shit, what the fuck, how did I get here, where do I go, oh my god! Snake's navigation of the facility is entirely stealth-based, meaning you have to traverse the environment as best you can without being detected, and you have a multitude of gadgets to assist you on that front. The premise is still very simple right from the get-go. Don't be seen. Your tiny health bar is incentive enough. The beginning few areas are simple enough that you just have to time your movements correctly to abuse gaps in surveillance. The game also forces you to crawl to get inside the facility no matter which entrance you take. You also introduce yourself to surveillance cameras, and you may have to choke a guard out to get past him. Within the first 2 rooms, you've already accustomed yourself to the basic stealth controls, and the starting area is also a good isolated playground for new players to come to terms and veterans to refresh, assuming you didn't try the VR training. Unfortunately, throughout the rest of the game, there are no other spotlights, noisy puddles, or footprint detecting soldiers. It's a bit of an empty promise to show so much depth and possibility with the gameplay and only use it once in the beginning. You can even go through the whole game without choking guards or knocking on walls.
Shut up! Shut up! Shut up!
That's not to say the game isn't without its isolated surprises, like the noisy grate,
What was that noise?
trapdoors, and seeing Meryl's panties. Twice. And if you go in and out of this air duct 100 times, you'll unlock the ability to play as Shadow the Hedgehog. Moving on, the first boss is disappointing because you don't actually get to fight him, but the second boss is just a game of Ring Around the Rosie while you shoot at nothing and hope it hits.
You better hurry up!
It's also at about this time where it becomes painfully obvious how much cutscenes intrude. From the time you land the last blow on Ocelot to when you regain control is 11 minutes of cutscenes in codec. The scene with Octopus and Meryl is another 10 minutes. Compare that with the 5 minutes it took me to get from the cell chamber to Baker and the 4 minutes to kill Ocelot, and you begin to see the uneven distribution. Everything that happens in those 21 total minutes of cutscenes is vital plot information, which is fine, but I can't help but feel like it could have been better dispersed, especially if they incorporated it through gameplay, which Metal Gear Solid proves it can do. Snake calls Meryl a rookie, and the nail is hammered down when she hesitates to shoot the first wave of enemies. The story is fine, it just breaks up the game too much. I hope it's clear now that I'm a master at game design, so you should take everything I say as fact. Anyway, as much as I'd like to do a play-by-play of the entire game, I'm going to skip ahead a bit. It can seem like half of Metal Gear Solid is stealth and the other half is boss fights, so I'm going to go into some more of those now as well. The fight with Ocelot highlights the poor camera, but the fight with Mantis highlights the poor gunplay. Most people remember Mantis as an awesome boss fight because of his introduction and psychic display, but in reality that's all that's good about him. He moves about the room throwing things at you and occasionally turns invisible, not exactly an original mechanic for a boss fight. There's no context clues which could possibly tell you to switch controller ports other than that he reads your movements. The fact that he moves your controller and reads your save data may have hinted that he was using your hardware against you, but switching controller ports is a leap in logic so far no one would ever make it unless they were either bored, stupid, or both. Colonel tells you. While the feature adds to Mantis' unique abilities, it's not a puzzle which you can be rewarded for solving because you can't solve it with rational thinking. Anyway, the crux of my issue with Mantis is that if you plan on taking him on with a gun, you're going to have some problems. Given the top-down perspective, you have 360 degrees to aim. The D-pad has input for the 4 cardinal directions, and 4 more if you press the 2 at the same time. That leaves you with only 8 sets of degrees in which you can aim. Metal Gear Solid corrects this issue to a degree by having a slight auto-aim when an enemy is in the line of sight. Mantis, however, rarely ever stops moving, and since you can't adjust your aim without moving slightly yourself, you can screw up your shot very easily. It's highlighted best towards the end of the battle where if you don't have the thermo goggles, you'd essentially have to wait in place for him to show up and shoot him once he appeared, since it's almost impossible to aim with the small window given. Mantis isn't a bad boss fight, he's average at best, but the poor aiming controls definitely dampened his fight. Fights like the one with Vulcan Raven are so much better since they rely less on the ability to make snap inputs like aiming a gun, and focus more on dealing damage in more stealth-centric ways, such as claymores and missiles. Much more fitting of a stealth game rather than a shooting gallery. The fight with the Hind D at least let you aim in first person and gave you ample time to predict attacks and dodge them accordingly. A bit more obtuse than Raven, but it still works well as a boss fight. Sniper Wolf's is another one which irks me. The first fight pits you coverless against her, so you have to focus on aiming and shooting her as quickly as possible. Not such a big deal now since you really only need to worry about 2 directions of movement. But the second encounter puts you in an area with more terrain. Ideally, you use the cover to stay out of the vision of Wolf, maybe sneak your way to a different landmark and then pop out and shoot her while she's focused on where you were. However, since it takes so long to walk out, get on the ground and aim your gun, you'll always be spotted by Wolf first. So it just becomes a repeat of the first fight where you simply track her movements and shoot her when she pops out. Once again, not an overtly bad boss fight, it just suffers from some limiting controls. Mantis, Wolf, and Raven have the benefit of having great introductory and death scenes. They seem more like real people rather than the average grunt, and they each get a bit of charm that no other characters share. It's the reason people remember their characters so fondly, but not so often their actual battles. It's also one of the main reasons Metal Gear games are so often joked about as movies. Too often they focus on character development and story rather than gameplay. Not to say character development and story are bad, but gameplay should never play second fiddle compared to them. Unless it's like a point and click or something. Backtracking is an issue which plagues the game to an unholy degree. Backtracking makes sense for a game like this. It allows you to go through familiar areas with better equipment and different enemy placement, which handled the right way is fine. But the game does not handle this the right way at all and shoves it in at the most inopportune times possible. After your walk through a surprisingly ineffective minefield, Meryl is shot at and is lying bleeding on the ground, and the game decides that this is a great time for you to backtrack back down to the second basement of a building several areas away, and then make your way back again. The enemy placement on some of the areas has changed a bit, forcing you to rethink your actions, but the tenuousness of the situation just leaves you wanting to get the story moving forward again. The most heinous backtracking mission happens at the very end of the game after you finally come face to face with Rex. You have to climb up it, climb back down, recollect the card key, climb back up, use it, climb back down, enter the freezer, wait a bit, re-enter the hangar, climb back up, input the key, climb back down, through the freezer, up both elevators, into the blast furnace, wait a bit, back down, both elevators, through the freezer, into the hangar, back up Rex, and input the final key, and it's nothing but a waste of my fucking time. It's just the last furtive attempt at squeezing all the lackluster stealth the game can muster before the finale. Like I said, backtracking can be implemented well, but in this case you're only going through the areas you were just in, and the only change is a few guards in the freezer you can easily walk past. It's practically the definition of padding and is the biggest black mark Metal Gear Solid has. All it has going for it is Naomi's arrest, and that could have been put pretty much anywhere. The entire end half of the game after the first sniper wolf fight seems to be a continual roll downhill. You're constantly thrust into combat situations, 90% of the time your radar is jammed and all the surveillance cameras are swapped with gun cameras. It then becomes a matter of throwing chaffs and running through areas only to walk into a forced combat section. I realize it's meant to make Snake less of a fly on the wall and more of an action hero. It varies up the gameplay a bit, but it's a shame it takes up an entire half of the game. Back on the topic of bosses. The fight with Rex is fine, avoid gunfire, avoid detection, throw some chaffs, shoot the radome. It can be a bit tricky at times, but this is the title boss the entire game is led up to. The second half of the fight is a bit more irritating as you essentially just balance yourself between the legs and shoot the hatch when it stops moving. A bit easier than the first phase, actually. Both of these phases can be a bit tedious depending on what strategy you use and how many times it takes you to get a good rhythm. Dying to the open cockpit phase resets you to the closed cockpit phase, and the tedium begins anew. The fight with Liquid is also extremely aggravating, as your punches do about as much damage as the breeze on a summer afternoon, and instead of fists, Liquid has miniature freight trains duct taped to his forearms. You could be having a solid lead, landing 300 consecutive punches on Liquid, but 2 jabs and a headbutt and suddenly the tables have turned. Liquid's fight style changes throughout the battle, making him harder as he loses health, which is fine, but his punches do too much damage across the board, and you essentially have to turn into Neo in order to dodge every attack and kick him off Metal Gear, or else he'll continually regenerate health. The fist fight with Grey Fox was pretty average, but it was much better in comparison since each phase gives Fox a moveset which doesn't take very long to read or learn to counter. The final car chase isn't so bad though. Shoot the barrels, shoot the soldiers, then shoot Liquid until you reach the end. A bit of a less personal way to finish off Liquid rather than a fist fight on top of Rex, but I guess they needed a way to bring him back so that Fox die could take effect. The stealth gameplay of Metal Gear Solid is a unique and rewarding experience only utilized in brief intervals throughout the game. The story is not only obtrusive to the player, but it also throws the stealth under the bus in favor of the narrative. I know I didn't really go very in-depth with the game, I just really like to bitch about a classic that everyone loves. It's been talked about and praised to death already, and I just wanted to point out that its pedestal isn't really that high off the ground. Don't get me wrong, somehow despite all its flaws, the redeeming gameplay and story elements push this game far beyond some of the more disappointing moments, and I still enjoy every second of it, even if it makes me want to rip my own skin off sometimes. The game's story and presentation is unprecedented for a game made back in 1998. It's chock full of little details and Easter eggs to keep you surprised and interested, and incentivizes repeat playthroughs with post-game items and split endings. The sum of all its parts come together to make a crude yet lovable experience that I still enjoy going back to this day. In layman's terms, it's one of the greatest pieces of shit I've ever played. From 1998.
There's nothing like the feeling of slamming a long silver bullet into a well-greased chain.
No, don't touch it! My hand! You're pretty good.